we in Israel don't expect much change in his absence. So, and I think that makes it even more unlikely that Israel was behind his death. He's not because he wasn't an important person.
Yeah,
and also,
essentially you're saying he's a pointless person to assassinate.
in a way, yes, but also, accidents do happen in this region. Not every accident that happens is because of Israel, but in this case, yes, his death is not going to change much.
5 days of mourning have been announced in Iran for President Ebrahim Raisi, who died in a helicopter crash. The first Vice President Mohammed Mokbar is taking over interim proceedings until elections take place in the next 50 days in Iran. In a moment, we're going to speak to Dr Meir Javedanfar, who teaches the Iranian Diplomatic and Security Studies course at a university in Israel. But first of all, we're going to speak to Mazia Bahari. She is the editor at IranWire.com, an Iranian journalist who was imprisoned in the country and cannot return. Welcome to the show, Mazia.
Nice to be here.
Thank you so much for coming on the show. Tell us what you know about what has happened to the president. What happened to the president? What is the thesis in Iran, as it were? Straightforward helicopter crash, or do people think it was something more sinister?
Well, there are always conspiracy theories, but most people who think logically and rationally think that it was an accident. Of course, it's an unnatural accident because the president and the foreign minister both were in the helicopter, and also they were using a very old American-made helicopter, which Iran purchased before the 1979 revolution. So the helicopter was at least 45 years old, and which I think in a normal country, both the president and the foreign minister should not be on a very old plane, flying in a very, very bad weather situation. So from what we know, someone from Iran, someone who is a member of the government in Iran, called us around 3 p.m. local time yesterday and told us that the government knows about the death of President Raisi, and they were working on the messaging. So we published the news at that time, and we said that the government knows about the death and they're working on the messaging. And it seemed that our source was right, because it took the government about 7 to 8 hours after we published the news to announce the fact that the president is dead. And I think at the moment, they're just thinking about Raisi's successor, and there are some candidates, and it's very important for Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the quote-unquote supreme leader of Iran, to support that candidate, because last time around in 2021, Raisi, we cannot say that he was elected as president of Iran. He was selected by Khamenei, and many candidates, including some conservatives, including some allies, Ayatollah Khamenei, were disqualified from running. So we have to see who will be Khamenei's selected president this time around.
So you were imprisoned by the regime, and in fact you can't return to Iran. We know that there's a huge amount of internal dissent in Iran on the one hand, and we also know that Iran is obviously engaged in the geopolitical issues surrounding the Israel-Gaza war. This president is largely ceremonial. Does it affect the balance of power within the regime in any shape or form?
It does. I mean, the president in Iran is like a prime minister in an absolute monarchy. So the prime minister in an absolute monarchy does not have that much power, but still he has his own allies, he has his own power base, and there are certain things that the president can do in Iran. But what is interesting about Raisi compared to the other presidents in Iran was that he did not have a power base of his own. He became a judge at a very early age, around, I think, 19, 20 years old in 1980. And then he served the regime loyally. He served the Ayatollah Khomeini. In the 1980s, he was a member of the Death Committee in 1988. He was one of the 3 people in charge of killing more than 5,000 political prisoners. And then he served the government loyally again as a judge and as the supreme leader's representative in the city of Mashhad, being in charge of a very large industrial and commercial complex. And then he became the head of the judiciary. But throughout that time, Raisi was not famous for having a base, having a power base. Other presidents in Iran, Ahmadinejad, Rouhani, Khatami, they had their own power bases. Raisi was defined by his loyalty to the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei. And because of that, Khamenei supported him. And the next president will most probably be a person that Khamenei will choose from his supporters who do not have a loyal base of their own, because Khamenei is 85 years old. He won't be living maybe for a long time.
He could be potentially choosing his successor, so it'll be fascinating to see. But thank you so much, Maziar Bahari, editor at IranWire.com. We're now going to speak to Dr. Meir Javedanfar, who teaches the Iran Diplomatic and Security Studies course at a university in Israel and is Iranian. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Tell us what the situation is like in Israel, who would obviously, I see they've had to issue a denial they were involved in the helicopter crash, but obviously the Israelis will be watching this with intense interest.
Yes, the question that all Israelis, when Israelis want to know is, will this lead to regime change in Iran? Because Israelis, more than perhaps any other country in this region, want the Islamic Republic to fall, because the 1979 revolution was a disaster for Israel. Before the revolution, Iran and Israel had good relations, and afterwards, the Islamic Republic of Iran decided to become Israel's biggest enemy and to support various proxy groups against Israel. To be honest with you, the absence of Mr. Raisi is not going to change much. He was not, as Maziar said quite accurately before, he was not a major player. He was a loyal foot soldier. He was more of a pawn than anything else for Ayatollah Khamenei. He followed orders. He wasn't a strategic thinker. He wasn't a strategic doer. He didn't have a security background, nor did he have a foreign policy background. So he wasn't much of a player when he came to the Middle East. So we in Israel don't expect much change in his absence. So, and I think that makes it even more unlikely that Israel was behind his death. He's not because he wasn't an important person.
Yeah,
and
so
also,
essentially you're saying he's a pointless person to assassinate.
In a way, yes, but also, accidents do happen in this region. Not every accident that happens is because of Israel, but in this case, yes, his death is not going to change much. He wasn't a strategic.
Yes. Let me ask you this then. Inside Iran, there's a huge amount of dissent and obviously opposition to the regime, which is brutally suppressed. We saw pictures of sort of fireworks being let off in the sky, which were an indication, perhaps, at least that's how it was read, of ordinary Iranians perhaps celebrating the death of one of the leading members of the regime. Will it potentially have any impact at all in giving, I mean, this sounds a brutal thing to say after somebody has died, but this is the real world and politics, give people, frankly, the feeling that they've scored a victory against this brutal dictatorship?
From what I can see on social media, Iranians are tremendously happy. And I hear the same from Iranians who are based in Europe, who speak to their family and friends in Iran. People are tremendously happy. Number one, because Mr. Raisi was one of the judges who sentenced to death somewhere between 3,000 to 30,000 Iranian prisoners. We're not sure exact number at the end of the 80s. Number two, he was a very close associate of Ayatollah Khamenei, and Ayatollah Khamenei trusted him greatly to carry out his orders. And people of Iran increasingly view the enemy, the Islamic Republic and Ayatollah Khamenei as their enemy. So when one of his foot soldiers dies, this has created a lot of, unfortunately, we have to say, happiness inside Iran. And last but not least, one of the areas where Mr. Raisi did have relative influence, and I emphasize relative, was the economy. And he did a terrible job of it. The inflation, he pushed it up. The inflation was pushed up under his tenure to 45%, which is almost unprecedented average for any post-revolution Iranian president. So not at the very least, we can say not a lot of people are going to miss him.